Hi, everyone. I'm Nazgul Gantnush, co-director of research at the Sentencing Project, and welcome to our webinar on racial disparities in incarceration, hosted by the Sentencing Project, Berkeley School of Theology, and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. We're going to get started with a message from Representative Barbara Lee.
I am delighted to introduce you to this webinar examining racial disparities in incarceration, hosted by the Sentencing Project, Berkeley School of Theology, and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Crime continues to be a problem that disproportionately impacts Black Americans, but mass incarceration is a failed response. We must persist in the struggle to end mass incarceration and invest in proven strategies to build healthy and prosperous communities for all. During today's event, you'll learn about the Sentencing Project's landmark 1 in 5 series of reports. This series identifies the progress made in the 21st century in reducing the United States prison population and its racial and ethnic disparities. 1 in 5 Black men born in 2001 is expected to be imprisoned within their lifetime. This is a travesty. The Congressional Black Caucus has established a criminal justice reform task force focused on the systemic reasons behind mass incarceration to identify effective policies that help reverse the mass incarceration that plagues Black communities. The task force also promotes comprehensive reform of our criminal justice system, police departments, and communities, and strengthening prison reentry support. In this webinar, you'll learn about the lived experience of incarceration and work to end the injustices of mass incarceration by people who have experienced its harm. You'll learn about the work that the Berkeley School of Theology and the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Restorative Justice, the J. Alfred Smith Senior Chair of Theology in the Public Square, are doing in their area. I am so grateful to serve on the board at BST and partner with them in their important work in California. You'll also learn about the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, whose mission is to advance the global Black community by developing leaders, informing policy, and educating the public. Discussions like this will help us identify the necessary reforms to end mass incarceration and its racial disparities, and to build the necessary relationships to do this hard work. We must invest to make all communities prosperous. Only this can build public safety without the cruelty of incarceration. We must recognize that extreme sentences disproportionately impact Black communities and expand reforms that scale back these sentences. And yes, we must end the practice of allowing criminal justice contact to determine access to the ballot. Being incarcerated should not interfere with the right to vote. The health of our democracy depends on it. Thank you, and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so much to Representative Barbara Lee for that message. You have been an inspiration to me for many years, and I'm really grateful that you've shared that message for us to include in this webinar today. I'm also really honored to present to you the panelists that we have on today's webinar. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then give you an overview of what today's event is going to consist of. So joining us today is Bill Underwood, Senior Fellow at the Sentencing Project, Reverend Dr. Joseph Evans, Director of the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Restorative Justice at the Berkeley School of Theology, and Nicole Austin Hillary, President and CEO of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So today's webinar is going to include an overview of the Sentencing Project's 1 in 5 report, which I'll present to you briefly. And then I'll turn it over to the panelists and ask them to speak about some of the issues that we've covered in the report, as well as more broadly to tell us about their work on these issues. And then we will have a Q&A with the audience. And so if you have questions that you'd like to pose to the panelists, please include that in the question and answer feature of the webinar. So let's get started. Through our four-part series, we at the Sentencing Project demonstrate how efforts to tackle racial disparities in incarceration have been making an impact. But we're also show that the progress is incomplete and under threat. So this series of reports offers a comprehensive framework for understanding sources of racial disparity in the criminal legal system, and it highlights reforms from around the country that can serve as models for jurisdictions nationwide. The title of the series, 1 in 5, is based on the most recent estimate of the lifetime likelihood of incarceration for young Black men. For Black men born in 2001, 1 in 5 are expected to be imprisoned within their lifetimes if we continue at current levels of incarceration. That rate is troublingly high, but it actually represents progress because a generation ago, 1 in 3 young Black men were expected to be imprisoned within their lifetimes. We can see this progress for other communities of color too. We know that nationwide, there's been decarceration in the last decade or so, but the rate of decarceration for Black Americans and people of color has outpaced that of whites. And in particular, this progress has happened among women. So for example, between 2000 and 2021, Black women's incarceration rate has fallen by 70%. Despite this progress, we still have a long way to go to achieve equity. You can see in this chart that Black Americans' imprisonment rate remains about 5 times as high as that of white Americans. American Indians and Latinx people are also far more likely to be imprisoned compared to white Americans, and Asian Americans have a lower imprisonment rate than white Americans. Between 1972 and 2009, and that's the darker part of the chart that we show here, the US prison population grew by nearly 700%. So that's from 1972 until the peak level in this chart. Since then, between 2009 and the most recent year that we have data, which is 2022, the prison population declined by 24%. So we're beginning to make a dent in undoing mass incarceration, but we still have such a long way to go to pull back on the 700% increase in the prison population that we accumulated over the past 5 decades. And if we keep going at the rate of decarceration that we've been going at, which is roughly 1% decline in the prison population every year, it's going to take nearly 75 years to return to 1972's level of imprisonment. And the red part of this chart is showing you that forecast, which is to say that the pace of progress is too slow. We would like to end mass incarceration within our lifetime. And so we really need to look and see where is progress being made and how can we lean into that in those jurisdictions and build on that and model after those reforms in other parts of the country. So the 1 in 5 series, as I mentioned, offers a comprehensive framework for understanding sources of racial disparity within the criminal legal system. And it highlights reforms that need to be replicated as well as defended in order to achieve racial equity in the criminal legal system. While the series focuses on reforms that are created within the criminal legal system, we believe it's also important to understand that some forms of disparity predate criminal legal contact and that we have to address those problems as well if we want to achieve racial equity. And so let me talk to you about racial disparities when it comes to serious criminal offending, in particular focusing on homicides. This chart shows you that historically and recently, Black Americans are much more likely to be victims of homicide in the United States compared to white Americans. And similarly, there are higher rates of homicide among other communities of color as well. Homicide is generally an intra-racial crime, meaning that people kill other people of the same race or ethnicity, typically. That means there's a higher rate of Black homicide offending compared to white homicide offending. If we want to solve this problem, we can only do that through tools that exist outside of the criminal legal system. This disparity has to do with the fact that people of color, and Black Americans in particular, disproportionately live in concentrated urban poverty. We have to tackle that problem if we want to tackle both these high levels of victimization and criminal offending. And that's why organizations like the National Academy of Sciences have recommended making, let me quote, durable investments in disadvantaged urban neighborhoods that match the persistent and longstanding nature of institutional disinvestment that such neighborhoods have endured over many years. These are the kinds of policies that we need to see, and these are reforms that need to happen outside of the criminal legal system. But let me also clarify that many of the disparities in incarceration that we see stem from not in differences in criminal activity, but from differences in how the criminal legal system responds to people. And let me illustrate that here with an example, drawing from a report that the ACLU put together, examining rates of marijuana use and comparing that with rates of marijuana possession arrests. And what they found is that when you look at how often people use marijuana or cannabis, it's nearly identical rates across race and ethnicity. So Black Americans use marijuana at 1.2 times the rate of whites, for example, but they're arrested at 3.6 times the rate of white Americans. And so this has everything to do with who police decide to stop, who in vehicles, on foot, who they search. That's what's contributing to these kinds of disparities in outcome, not disparities in criminal activity. So the series of reports, 1 and 5, presents a 4-part framework in understanding sources of disparity within the criminal legal system. The first source is disparate racial impact of laws and policies. The second is racial bias in the use of discretion. The third is financial burdens created by the criminal legal system. And the fourth is the collateral consequences of criminal legal contact. And so I'm going to briefly talk about each of these sources. So the first source of disparity, disparate racial impact in that stem from criminal laws and policies. You're maybe familiar with the crack cocaine sentencing disparity that exists at the federal level. Here's an example of disparate racial impact, which you may be less familiar with. And that has to do with the fact that the longest sentences that we impose in the criminal legal system end up landing on people of color, and in particular, Black Americans. And so let me illustrate that for you. The first bar in this chart shows you the percentage of the US population that's African American. That's 14%. The second bar shows you the percentage of the US prison population that's African American, and that's 33%. And then the bar on the right shows you the percentage of the prison population that's African American that has already served at least 10 years. And that's 46% African American. So when we look at the longest sentences, that's where we disproportionately find people of color, and particularly African Americans. And our research at the Sentencing Project has shown that when you look at people serving life without parole sentences, which is one of the most extreme sentences short of the death penalty, 55% of the population serving those sentences are African American. And so for this reason, organizations like ours, as well as the National Academy of Sciences, recommend scaling back extreme sentences through policies such as second look reforms that allow for judges to revisit extreme sentences and resentence people. So racial bias in the use of discretion. I think we think about this often when it comes to police decision-making, but let me illustrate this for you when it comes to prosecutorial decision-making. So we know from research, which comes thanks in part to prosecutors, reform-oriented prosecutors being willing to allow researchers to look closely and scrutinize their work. We know that prosecutors are more likely to bring habitual offender charges that evoke habitual offender laws and mandatory minimum sentences against Black Americans compared to white Americans who are similarly situated. So controlling for severity of the offense and criminal history. Prosecutors are also more likely to divert divert white Americans compared to Black and Latinx people from criminal penalties. And so this is a key source of disparity in criminal legal outcomes. And yet we know that in addition to this work and how prosecutors handle individual cases, there's also the impact that they have in the way that they lobby. And this is a quote from Carissa Bryn Hessick, and it shows, based on her research on what kind of engagement prosecutors have with legislatures, that she says American prosecutors are active lobbyists who routinely support making the criminal law harsher. So prosecutors' impact comes not only in how they handle individual cases, but also in how they handle, how they respond to legislative proposals. Thankfully, now we're in an era where reform-oriented prosecutors are organizing to move in a different direction, thanks to organizations like Fair and Just Prosecution, For the People, Prosecutors Alliance of California, and Vera's Motion for Justice. We're seeing the work of reform-oriented prosecutors being elevated. The third source of disparity within the criminal legal system is the financial burdens that are imposed on people who are navigating criminal contact with criminal justice contact. And so we know that Black Americans earn half as much as white Americans annually, and they have 1/7 of the average level of net worth of white Americans. And that means that policies in the criminal legal system that expect people to dip into wealth and to be able to produce a lot of resources are going to disadvantage people of color, and particularly Black Americans. And so bail requirements, the underfunding of indigent defense and encouraging people to pay for private defense counsel, many other expectations and requirements of navigating the criminal legal system impose financial burdens of people and produce worse outcomes for them if they're not able to produce these financial resources. Thankfully, there are reforms that we can now highlight that are moving in a different direction. So for example, Illinois became the first state to end cash bail in 2023. I included ellipses here in blue to remind myself to tell you that this was not an easy reform. There was a long fight where law enforcement and prosecutors sued to prevent this law from going into effect. And similarly, we saw in New York State a significant bail reform that was undertaken there in 2020, getting scaled back through various iterations so that by 2023, much of that reform was undone as a result of misguided claims by policymakers blaming that reform for an uptick in certain crimes and the failure of certain media outlets to be able to correct those claims. And then finally, the final source of disparity in the criminal legal system has to do with collateral consequences. As one of my colleagues once said, once the criminal justice system is done punishing you, you are not done being punished. For the rest of your life, you will face obstacles accessing housing, employment, accessing cash assistance and food stamps if you have a felony drug conviction. You will face obstacles in being able to vote. And yet, if you look at research on what helps people land on their feet and avoid criminal activity going forward after criminal justice contact, it's exactly the opposite of these policies. And so there's a lot of work still to be done, and thankfully a number of jurisdictions are leading in this effort. So at this point, the majority of states no longer impose a ban on cash assistance and food stamps for people with felony drug convictions. We would still like to get to the point where that's not a restriction in any state. In addition to that, a number of states are now considering proposals to remove restrictions on voting rights for incarcerated people, and certainly beyond that for people under community supervision and those who've already served their sentences. Washington, D.C. in recent years, for example, joined Maine, Vermont, and Puerto Rico in allowing people to vote even while they're incarcerated, so that the access to the franchise and contact with the criminal legal system are completely separated. And so I will stop there. And if you would like to learn more about some of these issues, please take a look at our 1 in 5 series. And at this point, I would really love to hear from our panelists. So I want to turn it over to you all and ask you first to please share with us how some of the work that you've been doing recently or currently relate to some of the issues that I've been just talking about. And so let's start with Joseph Evans, please.
Thank you, Nazgul. And let me congratulate you on a comprehensive report that I believe everyone should read. In fact, I've read many of the different aspects of the report over and over again. I am the chair, as someone said, J. Alfred Smith, Senior Professor of Theology in the Public Square, and the director for the Center for Truth, Racial Healing, and Restorative Justice. Now, those words, truth, racial healing, and restorative justice, intersect, and that is one of the reasons why we're here today. The report that Nazgul and perhaps others on her staff and around her compiled and crafted and authored, that report is truth. And I urge you all to, again, to take a look at that report. And of course, the racial healing part, I think, stands out. We're talking about, as you will find out from reading her report, and I would start with the executive summary. The racial healing part will focus on extreme sentencing, and then secondly, communities of color are over policed. And then I think thirdly, and important is that we just heard, cash bail reform is an obstacle, frankly, in my view, to justice, and it's an undemocratic act. And so that helps us frame, at least from the Berkeley School of Theology's perspective, on how we would get involved. Let me give a couple of illustrations to bring you to date on how I personally got here on my journey. Prior to becoming an academic, I served two congregations as senior pastor, one in Huntington, West Virginia, which was in my home state, and secondly, in the nation's capital. The first congregation in the town of Huntington, West Virginia, college town, maybe about 70,000 people live there. So it was small enough for me to know a lot of different people, and particularly the magistrates who I had to visit over and over again to negotiate with them about predominantly African-American men being caught into the system for doing similar things that students at the university literally sat outside in front of their dormitory smoking marijuana. Most of the people that I went to negotiate and advocate for were not down on the college campus smoking marijuana in front of the dorms. If anything, they were smoking it somewhere near their house or on their porch or in their backyard. And there were jump out squads to come and arrest these young males. And that wasn't something that was really new to me. I'd been conditioned as a little boy to be aware that I could do anything wrong and literally be caught in the system for the rest of my life. If we fast forward and go to the nation's capital, where obviously is a much larger city, it was much more difficult to develop relationships with magistrates and others who had the gatekeeper on how young people would be treated. It was a city, and I love the city very much, but the jump out squads were just every day. And again, if we went to any major university in the nation's capital, you would see the same behavior that many of these young people were being caught into the system. So I have been looking at this for years now and becoming more impassioned about the undemocratic act that we're facing, again, with extreme sentencing, communities of color being over-policed, and then lastly, the cash bail reform. I can assure you that over years, I've had to raise money as a pastor just to try to get folks out of jail so that they could go home, not be in a dangerous environment for crimes that, frankly, oftentimes weren't proven they were even the persons that were involved in the crimes. But that takes a lot of money to be able to do that. Finally, I would just make the point in this opening segment that 20% of African-American males will at some point in their lives be subjugated to the prison industrial complex. So if that's 2 in 5, that's 4 in 10. And if it's 4 and twin, you can do the math. 20% is a daunting number of young people who can literally be placed in a system. And frankly, it's really slavery by another name. And so I hope that we'll get involved and deeply delve into some of the issues at hand. I'm really happy to be with my esteemed colleagues on this panel, and I would yield back time to hear what they're saying. And I thank you again for the report, and thank you for convening this very important webinar.
Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to turn over to Bill Underwood. Welcome, Bill. Can you tell us about how your work relates to what we've been talking about? Oh, Bill, you're on mute. Gotcha.
Thank you for everyone participating. My name is Bill Underwood. I work at the Sentencing Project on their campaign to end life imprisonment. I'm a senior fellow at the Sentencing Project. I know firsthand what Dr. Evans speaks of. Until 2021, I spent half of my life in federal prison. I was incarcerated in 1988. I got the opportunity to come home in 2021. And right now, there are nearly 160,000 people in federal prisons, and 3/4 of them are people of color. In 2018, Congress passed, and then President Donald Trump signed into law the bipartisan First Step Act. It was a sweeping criminal justice reform bill designed to promote rehabilitation, lower recidivism, and reduce excessive sentences in the federal prison system. Lawmakers and advocates across both political parties supported the bill as a necessary step to address some of the harsh and biased laws of the 1980s, 1990s. I'm a direct recipient of the First Step Act, so I work to encourage Congress to fully implement and build on the First Step Act in 3 key ways. First, Congress should correct a drafting error in the First Step Act that excluded the oldest and sickest people in federal prisons from compassionate release by passing the Safer Detention Act. This would give some of the most vulnerable people in federal prisons who have aged out of crime a chance to go home, at least to petition the court for a chance to go home. Second, Congress should make key provisions of the First Step Act retroactive with the First Step Implementation Act. And finally, Congress should build on the First Step Act's movement toward ending the racist disparity between crack and powder cocaine sentencing by passing the Equal Act. Crimes involving crack cocaine should not be punished more harshly than those with powder, and people serving unfair sentences deserve a second chance. And I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you so much for this preview of your work, Bill. It's wonderful to have you as a colleague. Thank you for joining us today. And next, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. I'm delighted that you could be with us here today, Nicole. Please tell us about your work and how it relates to these topics.
Well, first of all, Nazgul, thank you so much for having the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation be a part of this critically important conversation. I'm pleased to be here with my esteemed panelists as well. You know, there was something that Mr. Evans said that Dr. Evans said at the start of his remarks that I thought was just salient. He used the word intersection. And intersectionality is a word that I think we have to keep in mind as we talk about these issues, because none of the issues that we are talking about are issues unto themselves. They are inextricably linked to pretty much every system that we have in this country, whether we're talking about the housing system, the economic system, the education system. And I think for all of us, the starting point has to be understanding that. And realizing that as we look at ways to deal with these issues and ways to put solid and concrete reforms in place, that we have to understand that we are not just tackling one myopic issue, but we're looking at systems changes. With that, let me say at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, where I'm privileged to serve as president and CEO, we were started as an organization in 1976 to do three things. Our mission is to empower the global Black community, but we do that through, and this is the intersectionality in our work. We work to empower and grow the next generation of Black leaders. We invest in critical research around the issues of concern to the larger Black community. And then we educate the public on these issues so that they understand, number one, what all of these issues entail. And when we say issues, we mean those issues that are most deeply impacting the Black community. But we also do research and do education so that communities are empowered to create the kind of change and impact they want to see. We simply want to be a vehicle for that kind of change and for that kind of empowerment for them. And I think that's another thing that we have to make certain as we have these conversations is always kept at the forefront. It's not about all of the smart, wonderful people who do this research and who get to have these wonderful conversations. It's really about us being in community and making sure that individuals in their own communities can be their own voices. So with that being said, let me say that for us, really digging into the research that can serve as a tool for communities is of the highest priority for us. We have at the foundation a division called the Center for Policy Analysis and Research. It is run by my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Cox, and we have not only staff internally, but we have fellows who come to the foundation. That's part of our Leadership Institute and that focus on growing the next generation of leaders. And these individuals come to us. They are doctoral students, they are lawyers, they are researchers, some of them are medical doctors, but they're people with an array of expertise who actually spend time with us at the foundation and then working with members on Capitol Hill, and they focus on these issues of concern. We spent a great deal of time in 2023 really trying to focus in on some of the intersectionality that I talked about earlier, where we felt that and if we look at the criminal justice system and where we really need to focus in on change, our researchers and our fellows really spent time really trying to hone in on those areas. So I want to bring to everyone's attention 3 reports that we released in 2023. One of them is called Eliminating Barriers to Reentry for Returning Citizens, a 50-state examination of reentry practices. Because in order for us to figure out as a community of change makers, we have to first really understand, well, what is going on around the country? And it really is a patchwork quilt of various efforts and ideas that are being generated and engaged in around the country in different jurisdictions. So we first have to understand, well, what is it? And that's how we learn also. We realize that information has to be shared, that is how we empower communities and people as well. So we wanted to look at what is happening around around the entire country. One of our other reports is called the Clean Slate Act, a pathway to criminal justice reform. You heard Mr. Underwood talk very saliently about some specific legislative reform issues that he felt needed to be dealt with. Well, we certainly want to look at not just ideas, but also look at what kinds of legislation is already being introduced or has been introduced that we think is worth and worthy of communities and researchers and other advocacy organizations looking at. And then finally, another report we released last year it was about the MORE Act, a comprehensive guide to economic benefits. And all of these reports taken together are really an attempt to lay out various avenues for creating change. The reports that the Sentencing Project introduced and wrote are really game changers as far as I'm concerned. We've had lots of decades of talking about these issues, but one of the things that we need to understand is that data is power, information is power, and what we are hearing and listening to from community members is power. And we have to really bring all of those things together to focus in on what works, what doesn't work, what we need to keep, what we need to throw away. And we also have to remember that the drumbeat has to continue. We cannot sleep on these issues. When you hear those numbers, and I have to tell you, I don't know about the rest of you, I remember in college saying to to my economics professor, I'm going to be a lawyer. I don't need all these numbers, but numbers tell a story, which we see, and we know that from these reports, and we know that it also gives us the evidence and the support that we need to make some of these changes. So I will stop simply by saying that I think we have to continue as a community of organizations, researchers, policy advocates, legislators who work on these issues. We have to continue to see these issues again as intricate and as having various tentacles that we have to look at. And we can't assume that once we have one thing done, that we've solved the problem. It was mentioned earlier, working on the Fair Sentencing Act. And I remember I was at a different organization then and worked on the Fair Sentencing Act. And I remember we were, of course, looking for parity in terms of sentencing with respect to crack versus powder cocaine. And we didn't quite get there. So we know there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think having conversations like this, sharing information, but also making sure that we're taking that information out to communities is vitally important. One of the things we do at the foundation is we engage in community conversations where we go to cities and jurisdictions around the country and we have panel discussions, but not just panel discussions, we have workshops where we ask the individuals, the advocates, the policymakers, the activists in the communities to sit around tables with us and really brainstorm and talk about problem solving. I, for one, don't relish having conversations where we don't walk away with real concretized solutions and at least concretized next steps. And it is my hope that as we continue to have these conversations and we do the research we do at the foundation and the Sentencing Project does the research that they do, that we will continue to actually put a pin in some of these issues and have specific takeaways that individuals can take back to their communities and actually start to implement.
Thank you so much for that fantastic overview. So I want to actually follow up with you, Nicole, and ask you about, and I hope everyone is okay. I'm going to refer to you all by your first names. I hope that you don't mind. I'd love to ask you to go to reflect on the last decade plus period of time where advocates from civil rights organizations and with support from members of the Congressional Black Caucus have been, and others have been working to reduce incarceration levels and reduce levels of disparity, such as the reform that you mentioned, which reduced the crack cocaine sentencing disparity, but has yet to eliminate it. I wonder if you can reflect on that work and share with us what are some insights in terms of lessons that can be drawn of what has made that work effective that we can use to carry forward for future advocacy. I know that based on the chat comments right now, we have a lot of advocates with us, formerly incarcerated folks, as well as just others who want to be able to be part of the solution. And so what are some lessons to share from that experience that you've had?
Sure. I'm going to give everyone another phrase. I know I already held up the word intersectionality. I also want to hold up the phrase cross-pollination, because one of the things that I have learned in my years of working on these issues is that we have to make certain that we are talking to other advocates, researchers, grassroots folks from around the country. And I'll give you one salient example. One of the other issues that many of us have worked on for years, and that certainly at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation we are focused on, are the issues around voting. But the issue of voting for those individuals who were formerly incarcerated has been a huge issue that we have worked on for many decades. It's something that we focus on at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation as we look at voting. It's also something that I spent a huge part of my career working on when I was at other research, civil and human rights organizations. We have to make sure that we are engaging with folks in those various communities. I will tell you, one of the reasons that we made any inroads when it came to restoring the right to vote is because if we didn't figure out how to do it right in one state, well, we were learning from that and then putting some of those practices into place in another state. Even though I was working during my career in Washington, I can't tell you how much time I spent in Florida with the wonderful advocate and change maker Desmond Meade, who many of us know, who has been just a champion and a change maker when it comes to the issue of restoring the right to vote to the formerly incarcerated. Cross-pollination is extremely important, and it's one of the tools that I think we've seen that have allowed us to really create change and have impact. We have to make sure that we are talking to one another and sharing ideas and practices. And here's another thing that I want to say that has been vitally important, that I think is sometimes harder to come by in this day and age, but I don't want us to forget that it's necessary. And that is working across lines. We don't all necessarily look alike, think alike, vote alike, but we really do live in one society together. So again, at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, we focus on global empowerment. So it is vitally important that we reach across lines and differences to talk about where we have shared experiences, where we have shared thinking about creating change and putting new policies and practices into place. It's very difficult for any of our communities to create change and to have achievements alone, working alone. And what we also know is that the human condition and the human experiences go far beyond labels, titles, parties, color, religion, and you fill in the blank. It goes beyond that. And I think one of the really important things that I've learned is that when we cross those lines, when we reach out to have discussions with, to compare notes with, to see where we can have a meeting of the minds, that has been hugely impactful. And again, I use the work on trying to restore the right to vote to the formerly incarcerated as a huge example of that. Folks across party lines, et cetera, work together very diligently to create change in some of the states where we have seen really good reforms put in place.
Thank you so much. So cross-pollination and work across lines. Got it. Appreciate that.
And intersectionality. That's three.
Mhm.
That's three.
Thank you. Thank you. So Joseph, I'd like to turn it over to you and ask you to say a bit more about how, well, first as context, we really are excited about this collaboration and ongoing work that we'll be doing hopefully together with you as well as with the other organizations here. And we at the Sentencing Project have always been inspired by our collaboration with faith organizations. And so I wonder if you could talk about how you came to this work and how the process has been to bring your community to begin to think about and work on criminal legal reform issues.
Well, thank you. And first, Nicole, that was spot on. Everything you said. I take notes, by the way, so you may hear these again somewhere very, very soon. Our concern here at Berkeley School of Theology, in fact, the founding of this school has been around issues like this. The school was created out of the Reconstruction period. By that, I mean as far back as the Civil War and the failed policies of the Reconstruction, frankly, birthed Berkeley School of Theology. Ironically, similarly to many of the HBCUs, particularly Spelman, Morehouse, Clark Atlanta University, Virginia Union, et cetera, et cetera. And this institution was founded in that same type of context. And so we're talking a long time. So this is not new to Berkeley School of Theology. In fact, our president, Jim Brenneman, is front and center on making certain that these types of issues are part of our theological praxis. And we train our clergy persons literally to go out and do things like this. Let me just contextualize. Let's talk about Oakland, California, because that's my concern now. Incidentally, your report, Nazgo, really affirms a report that came out recently in Oakland entitled The Cost. It talks about $122 million a year are spent on homelessness as opposed to solving the unhoused as a problem or a challenge. The faith community in Oakland and what we call the East Bay here are very concerned about those issues. In fact, I've learned a lot from the local clergy persons in this area since being here. And I would just simply say that it is important for us to take note that the clergy persons are the first people on the ground that generally know more about the issues in their community than anyone else, frankly. They have a lot of opportunities and responsibilities to take care of people who, by the way, at least any congregation that you go to, at least 2 out of 5 of persons in that congregation either know someone who's has been incarcerated or someone who's incarcerated now. There's a big push in Oakland to do anti-gun violence. In fact, there have been opportunities in Oakland, California, where pastors have led, where people literally have brought in their weapons and turned them over. I find that to be extremely impressive, their involvement in this city and surrounding areas. I think, too, it may be equally important is, again, to go back to cross-pollination and intersection to talk about the there is a corollary, if not a direct corollary, between unhoused and the numbers of people who are placed in incarceration. Why? Because it's easy to pick those kind of folks off. I mean, they're trying to survive. Literally every day they are trying to survive. And so we have to deconstruct and dismantle that type of policing. That's another way of talking about over policing particular communities. They literally have maps like if you and I were military personnel, you could literally see maps similar to that, where there are places on that map that are considered, Delta, dangerous, this, that, color coded, to where they literally on any given day will go there to, frankly, over police those groups. And I think Bill Underwood is kind of shaking his head because he's aware of that. So it's good to have someone also who's aware of those things. So the clergy persons here are trying her and his best, frankly, to address those issues. And here at Berkeley School of Theology, our role is to offer agency. That is, we want to be partners in helping do these types of things. So we help to bring people like Nicole and Nasco and Bill to a panel discussion like this, so that we hear and get ideas of what we can do in our local communities. And I believe people across the country are doing the same thing. I bet everyone's writing down notes, and I hope everyone is writing in the chat so that we also can get ideas of what you're doing in your own locales. And with that, I hope that I've addressed what you've asked, Nasgo, but I would like to yield and hear what perhaps another panelist has to say.
Thank you so much. So, Bill, I think many of us are waiting to hear more from you. So I have a question for you. I want to welcome you home. I know you recently celebrated 3 years of being home. It's wonderful to have you. In 2021, you received compassionate release from a federal prison sentence after serving 33 years on a life sentence. Can you share with us your insights on how race impacted your conviction and experience with incarceration, how your experience differed or was similar to other men that you were incarcerated with?
Okay.
Oh, Bill, we need you to unmute again.
Okay, I was saying I made some notes. I want to make sure I get everything in. Okay, in my first 15 years of prison, the population exploded with young, and I mean really young, Black men who were given extraordinary sentences for 50 grams or more of crack cocaine. Heart-wrenching cases of young men who were low-level dealers but were treated as if they were cartel kingpins. 50 grams or more was the prosecutorial key phrase and call sign that signified to the judge to use the full power of mandatory minimums and treat these cases and individuals as the pariah of society. Every case I looked at with these youngsters who all had life sentences. If you had 10 counts of 50 grams or more, you had 10 life sentences. I know some youngsters, 13 counts, 13 life sentences, all 50 grams or more. Okay. This provided the Bureau of Prisons with an unprecedented labor resource to foster growth in white, rural, low-income communities where the majority of the institutions were being built. This also created extreme tension amongst the different races of men. Prisons, I can tell you firsthand, prisons foster racial tension as a byproduct of the environment. Couple that with the addition of overwhelming numbers of young, uneducated Black men, and the setting is ripe to explode.
Thank you so much, Bill. Well, we are running out of time faster than I thought. And so what I'm going to do is ask everybody a question that sort of puts together a question that I had, as well as some of the questions that I've seen from the chat. And I would love for each of you to take whichever part of this question you'd love to address. And so what I'm wondering about is, we know that there's the underlying communities of color are disproportionately impacted by crime. And so what are the kinds of policies that you recommend people advocating for in order to address that? And as a second part of that is that going into this election season, we know that there's going to be a lot of false solutions that get proposed. And so what are some ways to resist those calls for how to address some of the underlying crime problems that we would like to have meaningful solutions to? And what are some ways that people can be involved as part of this effort? And so I'll turn it to you all to take whichever part of that question you'd like.
Well, I'll jump in if that's okay. And as I was listening to you, Mr. Underwood, and thank you I want to name how much we appreciate you sharing your story with us and being in this space with us. We do not take it for granted. We need to make sure that we all learn, understand, and remember our history. Because Nazgul, when you talk about where we are right now in 2024, heading into an election, we are not seeing a new playbook. We are seeing certain stories told. We are seeing certain techniques leveraged against vulnerable communities. We must not forget the history of the fight for criminal justice reform. It is going to undergird what we do going forward. Because if we forget that history, we forget the fight, we will become complacent and comfortable. And we'll also allow other people to tell our stories and define for us what real reform looks like and what our communities should look like. I will tell you that and this is just a personal anecdote, when I graduated from law school, or was about to graduate from law school, I was a finalist for a national fellowship at a major civil rights organization. And they asked me a question regarding criminal justice or crime in neighborhoods. And they asked me about cameras in public housing projects. Now, I'm not going to tell you all what my answer was, but I'm going to tell you this. What I did say to them in my answer is that I'm a product of public housing, that I grew up in public housing, and that the first thing we have to center is, what do the people who live in those communities want for themselves? Before we as an organization, should I get this job, go in and tell them what they should think and do. And that is because history has shown us what happens when others come in and try to define what real solution, what real reform should look like. We have to make sure that we are centering that we are centering the history, that we're remembering it, that we're remembering the lessons, and that we are keeping in the forefront that the people who are most impacted, the people who are actually living and breathing these stories and experiences, are the ones that we have to keep first and in the forefront. The reports that we do at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, they are not devoid of those stories and those voices. That has to be something that, Nazgul, as we are looking at this election, this important election year, that we remember and that we utilize, lest we fall backwards in terms of the gains we've made in terms of criminal justice reform. And we also have to keep speaking up about the importance of of communities and reform and change, because other people need to prioritize these issues just like we do. Again, I go back to cross-pollination and intersectionality. There's no one in this democracy who should not think that these issues are priorities for them. I don't care if you're an expert in education, if you're an expert in housing, if you're an expert in environmental justice. These are issues that impact all of us and all of our work and all of our communities. So I think we also have to continue to beat the drumbeat that this is not just something that is of concern for some of us. It is something that is of concern for all of us, and it behooves all of us collectively as a community to continue working on creating a more just and equitable criminal justice system. It has a trickle-down effect and impacts what real democracy looks like for all of us.
Thank you so much. Joseph, I'm going to have you wrap things up for us and reflect on this discussion. But before that, I just want to ask one final question to Bill. Bill, your experience inspired Senator Cory Booker and Representative Karen Bass's Second Look Act, which would have allowed judges to reevaluate sentences after 10 years of imprisonment. Since you've experienced this issue personally, and you are now advocating for reform, can you tell us about the current work that you're doing and its connection to the folks that you know that are incarcerated?
Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay. So during my 3+ decades that I spent incarcerated, advocating for myself, I had to learn the law, and yeah, in prison, you can, if you want to, you can really focus in on, so I was called to advocate for other prisoners who did not have the ability to do so for themselves, So upon returning to society, it's only natural, and some call it prisoner's remorse or whatever, or, the people you left behind, is only natural that you would want to advocate for them. And as I previously mentioned, some of the oldest individuals in federal prisons, often called old law prisoners, are ineligible for compassionate release. And they often cannot advocate for themselves due partially to infirmity and misinformation, which flows freely through the Bureau of Prisons. Misinformation. Advocacy for me provides a voice for the voiceless because they're in no position to speak to Congress. I'm grateful to have had the privilege of testifying before Congress on these very issues that we're speaking about twice in the space of 11 months, twice, okay? It's critical that lawmakers hear from people like me. The stories of formerly incarcerated people ultimately change hearts and minds, okay? People in prison are often silenced. They cannot advocate for themselves when the worldwide plague unleashes itself upon society, okay? They cannot advocate for meaningful change in the law. Something as simple as a technical correction, for example, to the First Step Act, will provide old law prisoners. And I mean, when I say old law prisoners, these people are really old, I'm 70 and we're talking about people in their 80s and older, they will provide the First Step Act, a technical correction will provide them the ability to petition the court for relief. They cannot do that behind those proverbial walls without people like ourselves, advocates like ourselves. People like me recognize from experience what advocacy means for those who are lost in the throes of the Bureau of Prisons. I and others like me, male and female, are called to the task of making a difference for those we left behind.
Thank you so much for your continued engagement and for your leadership on these issues.
Many opportunity.
I'm going to turn it over to Joseph now to close us out with concluding thoughts. And thank you, Joseph.
Well, thank you, Nazgul. And again, I want to compliment you on a thorough and comprehensive and brilliant report that again, I ask all of you who are viewing and listening, please read the report. That alone will help you and I be aware of so much that's going on. And Brother Bill, it is an honor, sir, to share on a panel with you. You have given me hope today. And Nicole, you were brilliant. And I hope that we can, at some point in the very near future, have you come and speak to us. We would love to hear you. Let me share with you just a few things I think may be of some interest to you. Let me begin with, how do I put this? I think it's important for community groups, and let me just say the faith communities now. I think it's important for us to always side with the most vulnerable. If you side with the most vulnerable in every instance, we have an opportunity to keep many people out of the system, which means radically changing how we do ministry. I think every congregation should have a prison ministry, jail ministry, whatever you want to call it, incarceration ministry. I think we should be in every opportunity to visit the incarcerated. And then there are groups that we can have in our local congregations for people who either support groups for people who have a loved one who is incarcerated or people who have been incarcerated. It's really good to hear their stories. If we hear their stories and hear their narratives, it's a part of healing and a part of the restorative justice process. Finally, I want to return to Huntington, West Virginia, because this is where I got involved in this in the first place. One of the things that I did and learned to do was to write op-ed after op-ed after op-ed to the local newspaper about these issues over and over again. I just kept writing them. And I'm going to ask you to do the same in every community you're in. Write op-eds, do your research on the policing of community, of citizens in your community. Look at the cash bail and write op-eds over and over and over again. And then finally, there are three things I would add. If we want this to change and to deconstruct and even abolish what we understand as a prison industrial complex in this country, then we have three things I think we need to do. Number one, we have to advocate for political will. That is to advocate to our representatives to have the will to build coalitions with like-minded people to get things done for reform. Secondly, I think it's economic will. We have to take the money out of it. Cash bail is about money, and the prison industrial complex is about money. I read a report years ago that said by the fourth grade, if I can't, or little Johnny and little Sally can't read on level, they've already designed a bed for our kids in someone's incarceration facility. We have to take the economics out of it. And then finally, there has to be a moral will, and that comes back to faith-based people. We have to advocate over and over. And this goes beyond whether you're Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Muslim or Buddhist. It's about people. That's what we're about. And so I urge you to be a part of it. And that's I do look forward to our next opportunity to work together in one of these. I hope that we can do this on a regular basis and get the word out. It's an honor to be with you all today and to everybody across the country. And finally, a shout out. Thanks, Matthew. Matthew is my son, and he's tuning in. I saw your name come across there, Matt. You're true to your word, young man. Take the point. He knows what that means. All right, thanks.
Many thanks to you and to all of our panelists. Thank you to Representative Lee for her comments. You've informed us, you've challenged and inspired us. I'm very grateful for your participation in this webinar, and thanks to all who joined. Take care.